Whispers of war. The first light of dawn touches the wheat fields of eastern Ukraine like a gentle benediction, painting the endless expanse in shades of amber and gold. It is June 21st, 1941, a Saturday morning that carries the sweet promise of summer in its warm breath. The collective farm stretches toward the horizon, a patchwork quilt of cultivation that has fed generations, where the rhythm of seasons has remained unchanged for centuries. Klara Petrenko awakens in her small wooden cottage, as she has every morning for the past 3 years. At 24, she possesses the kind of quiet strength that comes from working the land. Hands calloused from harvest, eyes bright with the satisfaction of honest labor. She moves through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, lighting the wood stove, preparing her simple breakfast of black bread and tea. Through her single window, the world appears exactly as it should. Peaceful, productive, eternal. The collective farm of Novaya Zarya, New Dawn, lives up to its name on this particular morning. Children's laughter drifts from the village center, where families are already gathering for the day's work assignments. The mechanical hum of a distant tractor provides a modern counterpoint to the ancient songs of larks rising from the grain fields. Everything speaks of continuity, of a world where tomorrow will unfold much like today. Yet beneath this pastoral tranquility, currents of unease have been building for months. In the village's single administrative building, where portraits of Stalin gaze down from whitewashed walls, whispered conversations have grown more frequent, more urgent. Radio broadcasts from Moscow speak in careful euphemisms about increased vigilance and imperialist provocations. The local party secretary, Dmitry Volkov, has called more meetings in the past month than in the previous year combined. Klara steps outside her cottage, breathing deeply of the morning air that carries the green scent of growing things. She has learned to read the subtle signs that others might miss. The way conversations halt when certain topics arise. The nervous energy that has replaced the usual jovial banter among the farm workers. The fact that her brother Mikhail, serving with the Fifth Army near the border, hasn't written in 3 weeks. Though his letters usually arrive with clockwork regularity, the intelligence reports reaching Stalin's desk in the Kremlin tell a different story than the one unfolding in Klara's peaceful village. For months, German reconnaissance flights have been probing Soviet airspace with increasing boldness. Wehrmacht divisions have been massing along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Over 3 million men, 3,300 tanks, and 2,070 aircraft. The largest military buildup in human history is reaching its crescendo just beyond the horizon of Klara's awareness. But Stalin has chosen to interpret these signs through the lens of his own strategic calculations. The German war machine is already engaged on multiple fronts. Surely Hitler wouldn't risk opening another theater of operations. The non-aggression pact signed just 2 years earlier still holds, at least on paper. Intelligence warnings from Britain, and even from his own agents, are dismissed as capitalist provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into a premature conflict. This fatal miscalculation creates a cognitive dissonance that filters down through every level of Soviet society. Local commanders receive contradictory orders, maintain readiness, but avoid provocative actions. Factory workers increase production of military equipment while being told it's merely precautionary. Families like Klara's sense the growing tension but lack the context to understand its true magnitude. As Klara walks toward the collective's central barn, she encounters her neighbor, old Pavel Antonovich, tending to his small garden plot. At 72, he has lived through revolution, civil war, and the great famines. His weathered face carries the accumulated wisdom of survival, and his eyes hold a wariness that younger villagers haven't yet learned to recognize. "Good morning, Uncle Pavel," she greets him, using the respectful diminutive reserved for village elders. He straightens slowly, his gaze drifting westward toward the invisible border. "Morning, little dove. Sleep well?" "Like the dead," she replies, then immediately regrets the phrase. Something in Pavel's expression suggests that such comparisons carry more weight than usual this morning. "The radio was crackling last night," he mentions casually, though nothing about Pavel is ever truly casual. "Atmospheric disturbances," they said, "makes a man wonder what else might be disturbed today." The old man's cryptic observations reflect a deeper understanding of the historical forces at work. Pavel remembers the last time foreign armies crossed these lands. The chaos of the Great War, the German occupation of 1918, the brutality of competing ideologies tearing communities apart. He recognizes the signs that educated party officials have been trained to ignore or reinterpret. Clara continues toward the barn, but Pavel's words echo in her mind. The radio has indeed been unreliable lately. Broadcasts interrupted by static, programming changes announced with unusual frequency. Even the weather reports seem to carry an undercurrent of urgency, as if meteorological conditions have somehow become matters of state security. Inside the barn, the morning work assignments proceed with their usual efficiency. Dmitry Volkov stands before a hand-drawn chart, allocating workers to various fields and tasks. His voice carries its customary authority, but Clara notices the way his fingers drum against his thigh, a nervous habit she's observed with increasing frequency. When he announces that today's harvest crews will work closer to the village rather than in the western fields, he offers no explanation for this deviation from the planned schedule. The decision, though presented as a routine adjustment, reflects intelligence that has finally penetrated the layers of bureaucratic denial. Border guards have reported unusual activity throughout the night. Movement of vehicles, concentration of forces, the kind of logistical preparations that precede major military operations. Local commanders, caught between contradictory orders from Moscow, have begun making their own tactical decisions based on immediate observations rather than political directives. Clara joins a crew assigned to the eastern wheat fields, working alongside friends she has known since childhood. Their conversation flows with the easy rhythm of shared labor. Gossip about upcoming marriages, concerns about crop yields, speculation about new agricultural techniques. Yet underneath this normalcy, questions surface with increasing persistence. "Has anyone heard from the Kozlov boys?" asks Anya, referring to two brothers serving in frontier units. "Nothing since the beginning of the month," replies Sergei, pausing in his work. "But you know how it is with military mail." The silence that follows suggests that everyone knows military mail isn't usually this irregular. Families throughout the village have noticed the same pattern. Correspondence from sons, brothers, and husbands serving near the border has simply stopped. Official explanations speak of training exercises and communication restrictions, but the absence of letters creates a void that imagination fills with darker possibilities. As the morning progresses, the sun climbs higher into a sky of perfect blue. The temperature rises to that comfortable warmth that makes physical labor almost pleasant. Larks continue their territorial songs, and a gentle breeze carries the scent of wildflowers from the field margins. Everything about the day suggests that nature, at least, remains indifferent to human ambitions and anxieties. But even nature carries subtle signs for those trained to read them. Clara notices that the usual migration patterns of birds seem disrupted. Flocks moving in unusual directions, as if responding to disturbances beyond human perception. The farm's horses display a restlessness that their handlers attribute to the approaching thunderstorm season, though no clouds mar the pristine sky. These observations might seem like folklore or superstition, but they reflect a fundamental truth about the relationship between human conflict and the natural world. Large-scale military movements create vibrations that travel through the earth. The rumble of thousands of vehicles, the tremor of massed artillery being positioned, the electromagnetic interference of radio communications operating at unprecedented volumes. By midday, when the work crews break for their simple meal of bread, cheese, and kvass, the conversations have taken on a different quality. Dmitry Volkov joins them in the field rather than returning to his office. An unusual gesture that everyone notices, but no one comments upon directly. He seems to be listening for something, his attention drifting westward at regular intervals, as if expecting to hear sounds that haven't yet reached their ears. "Comrade Volkov," ventures old Sergei, "will we be working the western fields next week as planned?" The party secretary considers the question longer than it warrants. "We'll see what conditions develop," he finally answers. Flexibility is important in agricultural planning. It's a non-answer that raises more questions than it resolves. Agricultural planning on collective farms follows strict schedules determined months in advance. Flexibility is not typically encouraged when it comes to meeting production quotas and delivery deadlines. As the afternoon work period begins, Clara finds herself assigned to a task that keeps her near the village center rather than in the distant fields. Again, no explanation is offered for this change in routine, but she begins to understand that someone, whether Dmitry Volkov or higher authorities, has decided that keeping workers close to home is more important than maintaining optimal agricultural efficiency. The realization brings with it a chill that has nothing to do with the warm summer air. Whatever is coming, whatever has disrupted radio communications, halted military correspondence, and altered carefully planned work schedules, it's approaching with the inexorable momentum of a gathering storm. And like the calm that precedes the most violent weather, this peaceful Saturday afternoon in the Ukrainian countryside carries within it the seeds of transformation that will reshape not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of the 20th century. And the Iron Curtain rises. At precisely 3:15 in the morning, the horizon began to glow with an unnatural light. Not the gentle amber of dawn, but the harsh mechanical flicker of distant explosions. Clara stirred in her narrow bed, pulled from sleep by a sound she couldn't quite identify. A low, persistent rumbling that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The dogs were barking, not the occasional yip of a startled animal, but a sustained chorus of alarm that carried across the entire village. Through her small window, she could see other lights beginning to flicker on in neighboring cottages. Tentative candles and oil lamps creating small pools of yellow warmth against the growing strangeness of the night. The rumbling grew stronger. Clara pressed her bare feet to the wooden floor and felt the vibrations traveling up through the floorboards, through her bones, settling in her chest like a second heartbeat. This was not thunder. Thunder came and went in rolling waves. This was constant, methodical, approaching. By the time she had pulled on her work dress and stepped outside, the eastern sky was alive with movement. Dark shapes moved across the stars, dozens of them, hundreds of them. The drone of aircraft engines filled the air with a mechanical symphony that had never before touched this quiet corner of Ukraine. Her neighbor, old Dmitry Volkov, stood in his doorway still wearing his nightshirt, his weathered face turned upward in bewilderment. Maneuvers, he called across the narrow space between their houses, but his voice carried no conviction. Must be maneuvers. The first explosions came from the direction of the railway junction. Bright orange flashes that painted the landscape in stark relief for split seconds before fading back to darkness. The sound followed moments later. Deep, earth-shaking concussions that rattled windows and sent chickens into panicked flight from their coops. Then came the realization that would change everything. The aircraft overhead were not Soviet. The crosses painted on their wings caught the reflected light of distant fires, and even in the pre-dawn darkness, their foreign design was unmistakable. These were Stukas and Heinkels, Messerschmitts and Junkers. The Luftwaffe had come to Ukraine. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had begun not with diplomatic fanfare or formal declarations, but with this overwhelming cascade of steel and fire descending from the darkness. Along a front stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 3.5 million German and Axis soldiers were crossing the border simultaneously. The largest military operation in human history was unfolding, and Clara Petrenko's village lay directly in its path. The ground assault arrived with the dawn. The rumbling that had begun as a distant tremor now revealed its source. An endless column of German armor moving along the main road like some mechanical river. Panzer IIIs and IVs, their angular silhouettes foreign and menacing against the familiar landscape of wheat fields and wooden fences. Half-tracks carrying infantry. Supply trucks, artillery pieces, the entire mechanized might of Army Group South flowing eastward with terrifying efficiency. The speed of the advance was breathtaking. German tactical doctrine emphasized rapid penetration, breakthrough and exploitation rather than the grinding attritional warfare of the previous conflict. These weren't the static trenches of the Western Front in 1918. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, designed to shatter enemy formations before they could organize effective resistance. And it was working with devastating effectiveness. The border guards, what few there were, had been overwhelmed in the opening minutes. Communication lines had been severed by air attacks and sabotage operations. Soviet commanders found themselves cut off from their units. Their carefully planned defensive positions bypassed or destroyed before they could be properly manned. Clara watched from behind her cottage as the first German soldiers entered the village proper. They moved with the casual confidence of men who had already won, their weapons held ready but not raised, their eyes scanning methodically for signs of resistance that simply weren't there. These were veterans of Poland and France, soldiers who had perfected the art of rapid occupation through 2 years of successful campaigns. The village elder, a man named Sergei Antonovich, who had served the Tsarist administration before the revolution, emerged from his house carrying a white cloth tied to a walking stick. His hands shook as he approached the German lieutenant who appeared to be commanding the lead element. The conversation was brief, conducted in broken German and gestures, but its meaning was clear. The village would not resist. The civilian population sought only to survive. But survival, Clara was beginning to understand, would not be simple. The Wehrmacht advance units were followed closely by other organizations, men wearing different uniforms with different purposes. Einsatzgruppen, special action groups, tasked with implementing the racial policies that formed the ideological core of Nazi Eastern expansion. Behind them came civil administrators, economic exploitation teams, and the entire apparatus of occupation designed to transform the Soviet Union into German living space. The transformation of the familiar landscape was both rapid and complete. German engineers began immediately converting the railway junction for their own logistical needs, modifying the track gauge to accommodate German rolling stock, establishing fuel depots and ammunition dumps. The village school was commandeered as a temporary headquarters. The grain elevator became a German supply point. But perhaps most disturbing was the systematic nature of the changes. This wasn't random destruction or chaotic looting. Every action seemed planned, coordinated, part of a larger design that had been worked out in careful detail long before the first shot was fired. The Germans had maps showing not just military targets, but civilian infrastructure, agricultural resources, population centers. They knew exactly what they wanted to control and how to control it. The first refugees began arriving by midday, families fleeing from villages further west, their possessions loaded onto farm carts or carried in simple bundles. Their faces carried the shocked expression of people whose entire world had been overturned in a matter of hours. They spoke of Soviet units retreating so rapidly that they abandoned equipment, of local officials disappearing in the night, of the complete breakdown of normal authority. And then came the smoke, black columns rising from the direction of the regional administrative center, from the collective farm's main facilities, from the railway yards. The retreating Soviet forces were implementing what would become known as the scorched earth policy, destroying anything that might be useful to the advancing Germans. The logic was strategically sound but personally devastating. If the Red Army couldn't hold territory, they would ensure that territory provided no benefit to the occupier. Grain stores were burned, livestock was driven away or slaughtered. Machinery was disabled or destroyed, fuel depots were ignited, the very infrastructure that supported civilian life became a target for destruction. Clara watched the smoke rising from the collective farm where she had worked for the past 3 years, the workshops, the administrative buildings, the carefully maintained equipment that represented years of communal labor, all of it being systematically destroyed by Soviet engineers who had arrived just hours ahead of the German advance. The irony was bitter and immediate. The Soviet state that had demanded such sacrifices from its citizens, that had collectivized their farms and reorganized their lives in the name of building socialism, was now destroying the fruits of that labor rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands. By afternoon, the character of the German presence had begun to evolve. The initial advance units, professional soldiers focused on military objectives, were being replaced by occupation forces with different priorities. Wehrmacht field kitchens appeared in the village square. Billeting officers began assigning German personnel to civilian homes. Administrative clerks started compiling lists of local resources and population. The reality of occupation was setting in. This wasn't a temporary military passage, a brief disruption before normal life resumed. The Germans were establishing the infrastructure of permanent control. They posted proclamations in German and broken Russian announcing new regulations. curfews, requirements for civilian registration, penalties for resistance or non-compliance. The speed of this transformation was perhaps the most shocking aspect of the entire experience. In less than 18 hours, Clara's village had passed from Soviet control to German administration. The flags had changed, the language of authority had changed, the very assumptions about daily life had been fundamentally altered, and this was happening simultaneously across thousands of square kilometers of Soviet territory. Entire regions, with their populations, their resources, their economic potential, were being transferred from one political system to another with the mechanical efficiency of a well-planned industrial operation. As evening approached, the sound of artillery could be heard from the east, a constant rumbling that suggested the front line was already many kilometers away. The German advance was continuing, pushing deeper into Soviet territory with each passing hour. The initial breakthrough had been achieved. Now came the exploitation phase, the race to destroy Soviet forces before they could establish new defensive lines. For the civilians left behind, the immediate crisis was survival in a world where all the familiar rules had suddenly ceased to apply. The Soviet officials who had governed their lives had fled or been captured. The economic system that had organized their labor had been disrupted or destroyed. Even basic questions, where to obtain food, how to protect their families, what behavior would be considered acceptable by the new authorities, had no clear answers. The Iron Curtain of war had descended across Ukraine, separating the present from the past with brutal finality. And for Clara Petrenko, standing in the doorway of her cottage, watching German soldiers patrol the village square where she had attended Communist Party meetings just days before, the future stretched ahead like an unmapped territory filled with dangers she could barely begin to imagine. Echoes of battle. 300 kilometers to the west, Obergefreiter Erich Müller pressed his eye to the periscope of his Panzer III and watched the Ukrainian countryside roll past in an endless procession of burning villages and abandoned fields. The tank's engine thrummed beneath him, a mechanical heartbeat that had become as familiar as his own pulse during these first weeks of what the High Command called the Great Crusade against Bolshevism. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steppe, and Erich found himself thinking of the wheat fields near his family's farm in Bavaria. The landscape here possessed a similar golden quality, but where his homeland's fields spoke of careful cultivation and centuries of peaceful harvest, these Ukrainian plains bore the black scars of deliberate destruction. Smoke columns rose from grain stores the retreating Soviets had torched. Wells had been poisoned. Livestock lay dead in pastures, shot rather than left for German use. "Halt!" came the voice of Lieutenant Brenner through the intercom. The panzer lurched to a stop, and Erich could hear the other tanks in their column following suit, the grinding of tracks and hissing of hydraulics creating a mechanical symphony that had become the soundtrack of their advance. Through his periscope, Erich observed a scene that had grown disturbingly familiar. A cluster of wooden houses, some still smoldering from the previous day's fighting, a few elderly civilians emerging cautiously from cellars and root shelters, and everywhere, the detritus of rapid military withdrawal. Abandoned Soviet equipment littered the roadside like metallic debris after a storm. The speed of their advance had been intoxicating at first. In 3 weeks, Army Group South had penetrated deeper into Soviet territory than Napoleon had managed in 3 months. The Wehrmacht's tactical superiority seemed absolute, their coordination of armor, artillery, and air support creating a combined arms effectiveness that shattered Soviet defensive positions with methodical precision. But Erich was beginning to understand that military success and strategic victory were not necessarily the same thing. The fuel gauges on his panzer told one story. The increasingly stretched supply lines told another. Every kilometer they advanced eastward added another kilometer to the logistical chain that connected them to German industrial capacity. And the Soviets, rather than collapsing as intelligence estimates had predicted, seemed to be trading space for time with a deliberate calculation that Erich found deeply unsettling. "Müller," Lieutenant Brenner's voice crackled through the intercom. "Dismount and check that farmhouse. Standard search protocol." Erich climbed out of the tank commander's hatch and dropped to the ground, his boots landing on soil that felt foreign beneath him despite its similarity to German earth. He approached the farmhouse with his Gewehr 43 held at the ready, though he had learned that the real dangers on this front rarely announced themselves with obvious threats. The building appeared empty, but Eric had developed an instinct for reading the subtle signs of recent habitation. A cooking pot still warm to the touch, bed linens that retained the impression of bodies, personal belongings arranged in ways that suggested hasty but deliberate selection, valuable items taken, sentimental objects reluctantly abandoned. In one room, he found a family photograph lying face down on a wooden table. When he turned it over, he saw a Ukrainian family, parents and 3 children, posed formally in their best clothing. The father wore a suit that spoke of modest prosperity. The mother's dress suggested pride in appearance despite limited means. The children displayed that particular mixture of solemnity and barely contained energy that characterized formal photographs everywhere. Eric stared at the image for a long moment, wondering where this family was now. Had they fled eastward with the retreating Red Army? Were they hiding in the forests that dotted this region? Or had they simply melted into the stream of refugees that seemed to flow constantly across the landscape like a human river seeking safety that might not exist anywhere? He set the photograph back on the table, face up this time, and continued his search. The systematic destruction the Soviets had implemented went far beyond military necessity. They were dismantling not just strategic infrastructure, but the entire foundation of civilized life. Railroad tracks had been torn up, and the rails twisted into unusable spirals. Bridges had been demolished with such thoroughness that even temporary repairs would require substantial engineering efforts. Power lines had been cut, and the poles felled across roads to impede German movement. Most disturbing was the agricultural sabotage. Grain silos had been emptied and burned. Farm equipment had been destroyed or evacuated. Even seed stocks had been eliminated, ensuring that these lands could not contribute to German food supplies for multiple growing seasons. The Soviets were implementing a scorched earth policy with a comprehensiveness that bordered on the fanatical. From a tactical perspective, Erich could appreciate the military logic. Deny the enemy resources, force him to extend his supply lines, make occupation as costly as possible. But witnessing the human cost of such policies, seeing the faces of Ukrainian civilians caught between 2 armies that viewed their homeland as a strategic commodity, created a moral weight that settled in his chest like accumulated lead. The radio in his panzer crackled with reports from other units in their division. The pattern was consistent across the entire front. Rapid territorial gains, minimal organized resistance, but also growing concerns about fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and the increasing distance from reliable supply bases. Lieutenant Brenner emerged from the tank and approached Erich with a map case under his arm. "Orders from regiment," he said, his voice carrying the particular weariness that had begun to affect all the officers as the campaign stretched beyond its original timeline. "We're to advance another 40 kilometers before establishing defensive positions for the night." Erich nodded, but privately he wondered about the sustainability of such pace. The panzer crews were operating on minimal sleep. Mechanical failures were increasing as tanks operated beyond their recommended maintenance intervals. And the psychological strain of constant movement through hostile territory was beginning to show in subtle but unmistakable ways. The men had stopped joking during their brief rest periods. Conversations had become more practical, focused on immediate necessities rather than speculation about future plans. Even their letters home had changed in tone, becoming shorter and more carefully worded, as if the writers were unconsciously protecting their families from understanding the true nature of their experiences. As they remounted their tanks and resumed the advance, Erich found himself thinking about the strategic assumptions that had shaped Operation Barbarossa. The plan had been predicated on achieving rapid victory through the destruction of Soviet military forces west of the Dnieper River. German intelligence had estimated that the Red Army would collapse within 6 to 8 weeks when faced with Wehrmacht tactical superiority. But the Soviets were not fighting according to German expectations. Rather than standing and defending fixed positions where German combined arms tactics could achieve decisive results, They were conducting a fighting withdrawal that preserved their forces while maximizing German logistical challenges. They were trading territory for time, and using that time to implement defensive measures that would make German occupation increasingly costly. The Ukrainian landscape itself seemed to be participating in this strategy of exhaustion. The roads, such as they were, had been designed for agricultural carts rather than mechanized military columns. The distances between population centers were vast enough to strain fuel supplies. The climate was beginning to shift toward autumn, promising weather conditions that would favor defenders over attackers. Most significantly, the sheer scale of the Soviet Union was becoming apparent in ways that map studies had failed to convey. Each day's advance, however successful in tactical terms, seemed to reveal only more landscape stretching endlessly eastward. The psychological effect was subtle but cumulative, like climbing a mountain only to discover that each apparent summit revealed another peak beyond. As his panzer crested a low hill, Erich caught sight of another burning village in the distance. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, a dark column that seemed to connect earth and sky like some ancient signal of distress. He had seen dozens of such fires during the past weeks, so many that they had become part of the visual landscape of war. But this time, something made him think again of that family photograph, and of Clara Petrenko standing in her doorway watching German soldiers patrol her village square. The war was creating a vast displacement of human lives, separating families, destroying communities, and forcing millions of people to navigate a landscape where the familiar landmarks of normal existence had been systematically eliminated. The tactical victories were real. The strategic momentum was undeniable. But Erich was beginning to understand that military success in the Soviet Union might require something more than superior tactics and battlefield coordination. It might require the willingness to sustain a level of destruction that would fundamentally alter the character of the civilization they were supposedly fighting to defend. The engine of his panzer continued its steady rhythm as they advanced deeper into Ukraine, carrying him further from the Bavaria of his childhood and deeper into a moral landscape he was only beginning to comprehend. Behind them, the black smoke of another destroyed village rose into the autumn sky, marking their passage like a funeral pyre for the world that had existed before the war began. The mud and the myths. By October, the autumn rains arrived with a vengeance that would reshape the entire character of the campaign. What the Germans called Rasputitsa, the season of mud, transformed the Ukrainian landscape into an endless expanse of sucking, clinging earth that swallowed vehicles whole and turned every mile into an ordeal of endurance. Erich watched from his commander's cupola as the panzer column ahead of them ground to a halt, their tracks spinning uselessly in mud that seemed to have no bottom. The roads that had carried them so swiftly across hundreds of miles in the summer heat now became rivers of brown sludge, impassable to all but the most determined infantry. "Scheisse," muttered his driver, Klaus, as their own tank lurched to one side, the left track losing purchase completely. "It's like trying to drive through chocolate pudding." The comparison would have been amusing under different circumstances, but as Erich surveyed the scene before them, dozens of vehicles mired in the muck, soldiers ankle-deep in mud trying to lay logs and metal planking for traction, he understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a temporary inconvenience. This was the moment when the Wehrmacht's greatest strength, its mobility, became irrelevant. The statistics tell only part of the story. Army Group Center, which had advanced over 400 miles in 6 weeks, now struggled to cover 4 miles in a day. Tanks that had outrun their supply lines in the race toward Moscow now sat motionless, their crews reduced to walking through knee-deep mud to fetch ammunition and fuel from trucks that couldn't reach them. But the human cost of this transformation was measured in more than miles per day. Erich watched his men age years in the span of weeks. The confident soldiers who had rolled across the Soviet border in June now moved with the exhausted shuffle of men who had pushed themselves beyond their limits and discovered that their limits were not nearly as distant as they had believed. "Sir," his radio operator called from below, "Regiment reports the supply convoy is stuck 12 kilometers back. No estimate on when they'll reach us. 12 kilometers. In the summer, that would have been a 15-minute drive. Now it might as well have been 1,200. The irony was not lost on Erich that the very landscape they were fighting to conquer had become their most formidable opponent. The Soviet Union's greatest defensive weapon was not its T-34 tanks or its Katyusha rockets, but the simple combination of earth and water that turned solid ground into an impassable morass. 300 kilometers to the southwest, Klara Petrenko was learning her own lessons about survival in a world where the old rules no longer applied. The German occupation of her village had settled into a routine of sorts, a deadly predictable cycle of searches, requisitions, and arbitrary punishments that defined the boundaries of what remained of normal life. She had found work in the kitchen of the German administrative headquarters, a converted schoolhouse where local collaborators processed the endless paperwork of occupation. The work was dangerous. Any mistake, any perceived slight, could result in immediate execution, but it provided access to information, and occasionally to food. "The roads are impossible," she heard one of the German clerks complaining to another as she cleaned the floors around their desks. "Nothing is getting through from Kiev. The fuel depot is nearly empty." Klara kept her expression carefully neutral as she worked, but her mind catalogued every detail. The occupiers' confidence was cracking. The machine-like efficiency of the early weeks was giving way to improvisation and frustration. That evening, she made her way carefully through the village streets to the cellar where her neighbor Anna Volkov was hiding with her 2 young children. Anna's husband had been taken in the first week of the occupation, accused of being a Communist Party member, though he had been nothing more than a village mechanic. "The Germans are having supply problems," Klara whispered as she shared the small portion of bread she had managed to save from her work. "Their trucks can't get through the mud." Anna's eyes showed the first spark of hope Klara had seen in weeks. "Does that mean—" "It means nothing yet," Klara replied firmly, "but it means the situation is changing. We need to be ready." Ready for what, neither of them could say. But in a world where change had meant only catastrophe for months, even the possibility of different circumstances felt like a form of salvation. The logistical nightmare facing the German forces was unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. The Wehrmacht had planned for a quick campaign, 6 to 8 weeks to reach Moscow and force Soviet capitulation. Their supply lines were designed for rapid advance and rapid victory, not for the grinding attrition of a prolonged campaign across impossible terrain. Colonel Friedrich Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, would later write in his diary, "The whole situation makes it increasingly plain that we have underestimated the Russian colossus. We reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now we have already counted 360. But the numbers of divisions told only part of the story. The real revelation was the Soviet capacity for resilience, the ability of both the military and civilian population to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting." Erich witnessed this resilience firsthand when his unit finally managed to extract itself from the mud and reach a small town that had changed hands 3 times in the past month. The buildings were largely destroyed, the infrastructure obliterated, but the people remained. An old man, perhaps 70 years old, stood in the ruins of what had once been his home. He watched the German tanks pass with eyes that held no fear, only a kind of patient endurance that spoke of having survived famines, revolutions, and purges long before this war began. "They think they can break us," the old man said quietly to a woman beside him, speaking in Russian but clearly intending the Germans to hear. "They don't understand. We are already broken. We have been broken so many times that we have learned how to live in the pieces." The words stayed with Erich long after they had passed through the town. There was something profoundly unsettling about an enemy who did not fear destruction, who had, in some sense, already been destroyed and learned to find strength in that destruction. By late October, the German advance had slowed to a crawl across the entire front. Army Group North was bogged down in the approaches to Leningrad. Army Group South was struggling through the mud toward the industrial centers of the Donbass. And Army Group Center, which had come tantalizingly close to Moscow, found itself fighting for every mile against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger as the Germans grew weaker. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated through 2 years of stunning victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans, was dissolving in the Ukrainian mud. Soldiers who had marched into Russia, believing they were participating in a glorious crusade, now found themselves questioning not just the strategy of the campaign, but its fundamental assumptions about German superiority and Soviet weakness. Erich's tank crew had been together since the invasion of France. They had developed the easy camaraderie of men who had shared danger and victory. But now, as they sat in their immobilized panzer, waiting for fuel that might never come, the conversations had taken on a different tone. "My brother writes from Berlin," Klaus said, cleaning his rifle for the third time that day. "Says they're telling everyone we'll be home for Christmas." "Which Christmas?" asked Heinrich, the gunner, with bitter humor. The question hung in the air like smoke from their cigarettes. Which Christmas indeed? The comfortable certainties of summer had given way to uncomfortable questions that no one wanted to ask directly. For Clara, the changing season brought different challenges. The German requisitions had stripped the village of most of its food stores. The approaching winter promised starvation for those without connections to the occupation authorities, which meant most of the population. But she had noticed something else in her work at the German headquarters. The officers were receiving different kinds of reports now. Instead of triumphant accounts of territory captured and enemies destroyed, the papers crossing their desks dealt with supply shortages, equipment failures, and casualty reports that grew longer each week. "We need to start thinking about winter quarters," she heard one officer say to another. "This campaign isn't going to end before the snow comes. Winter quarters." The phrase carried implications that would have been unthinkable in June. The German war machine, which had conquered most of Europe in a series of lightning campaigns, was preparing to settle in for a long, cold season in hostile territory. Hundreds of miles from home, surrounded by an enemy that refused to acknowledge defeat. That night, as Clara made her way home through streets patrolled by increasingly nervous German sentries, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The invaders who had arrived with such confidence were learning what every Ukrainian peasant knew: that survival in this land required more than superior weapons and tactical brilliance. It required the ability to endure, to bend without breaking, to find strength in the very act of continuing to exist when existence itself had become an act of resistance. The autumn rains continued to fall, turning the roads into rivers of mud and the certainties of summer into the doubts of winter. In that transformation, both occupier and occupied were discovering truths about themselves and each other that would reshape not just the campaign, but the entire character of the war that was only beginning to reveal its true nature. Hack. Winter's embrace. By November, the rains had given way to something far more unforgiving. The first snow fell like a whispered warning across the Ukrainian steppe, delicate flakes that melted instantly upon touching the still warm earth. But within days, those gentle warnings had transformed into nature's declaration of war against all human ambition. The cold arrived with the methodical precision of a military campaign. First came the morning frosts that turned puddles into sheets of treacherous ice. Then the deeper chill that made breath visible and fingers stiff inside inadequate gloves. Finally, the killing cold, the kind that transformed metal into instruments of torture and made every breath a conscious act of survival. Erich Müller discovered that his Panzer IV, so magnificent in the summer heat, had become a steel tomb in the dropping temperatures. The engine oil thickened to the consistency of molasses. The transmission fluid crystallized. The tracks, designed for the roads of France and the plains of Poland, cracked and shattered in the brutal freeze-thaw cycles of the Soviet winter. Each morning brought new mechanical failures that no amount of German engineering had anticipated. Batteries died in the cold, hydraulic systems seized. The very steel of the tank contracted and expanded with temperature changes that created stress fractures in critical components. What had been the Wehrmacht's technological advantage was being systematically dismantled by an enemy that required no supply lines, no ammunition, no strategic planning. The soldiers themselves were discovering the inadequacy of their preparation with each dropping degree. Summer uniforms, designed for a campaign that was supposed to end before the leaves turned, provided no protection against temperatures that fell to 20, then 30, then 40 degrees below zero. The Wehrmacht's quartermasters, so efficient in supplying armies across conquered Europe, had made their calculations based on victory by October. Winter clothing remained in warehouses in Germany, while German soldiers wrapped themselves in newspapers and stolen Soviet coats. Clara watched this transformation with a mixture of grim satisfaction and growing terror. The occupiers, who had seemed so invincible in their summer advance, were now huddled around inadequate fires, their faces blue with cold, their movements slow and desperate. She saw German soldiers with frostbitten fingers so severe they could no longer operate their weapons effectively. She witnessed the gradual breakdown of military discipline as survival instinct overcame training and ideology. But if the Germans were suffering, the civilian population faced something approaching apocalypse. The scorched earth tactics that had denied resources to the invaders had also eliminated the infrastructure necessary for surviving a Ukrainian winter. Grain stores that might have fed villages through the cold months had been burned or confiscated. Livestock that could have provided meat and warmth had been slaughtered or driven away. Coal supplies, essential for heating, had been destroyed or commandeered by the German forces for their own desperate needs. The village that had once been Clara's home was now a collection of damaged buildings housing people slowly starving in the cold. Windows broken during the fighting had been boarded up with whatever materials could be found, creating dark, airless spaces that trapped what little warmth could be generated. Families huddled together in single rooms, burning furniture and books and anything combustible to create brief moments of warmth in the endless cold. Food became an obsession that consumed every waking moment. A handful of grain could mean the difference between life and death. A piece of bread was treasure beyond calculation. Clara learned to make soup from potato peels and to extract nutrition from sources that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. She watched children grow thin and listless, their eyes taking on the hollow look of chronic hunger. The German supply situation deteriorated with each passing day. The mud that had slowed their advance in autumn had frozen into ruts and ridges that made transportation nearly impossible. Supply convoys that had once moved efficiently along Soviet roads now struggled through a landscape that seemed actively hostile to mechanized movement. Trucks broke down in the cold. Railway lines, damaged by retreating Soviet forces and inadequately repaired, became unreliable lifelines stretched beyond their capacity. Wehrmacht units that had advanced hundreds of kilometers from their supply bases found themselves isolated in a frozen wasteland, with inadequate food, insufficient ammunition, and no realistic prospect of resupply until spring. The German soldiers, trained for rapid movement and decisive victory, discovered the psychological toll of static warfare in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Erich found himself commanding not a tank unit, but a collection of frozen, desperate men trying to maintain some semblance of military organization, while facing an enemy that attacked without warning and disappeared into a landscape they knew intimately. The local population, which German planners had expected to welcome liberation from Soviet rule, had instead become a network of resistance that provided intelligence to Red Army units and sabotaged German operations with increasing effectiveness. The Winter War became a conflict of small, vicious encounters rather than grand strategic movements. Soviet forces, equipped with winter clothing and familiar with fighting in extreme cold, launched attacks designed not to capture territory, but to inflict maximum casualties on German units already weakened by the conditions. These raids came without warning. A sudden burst of gunfire from a tree line, a mortar attack on a supply convoy, the discovery that sentries had been killed silently in the night. German casualties from combat were matched and often exceeded by losses from cold-related injuries. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and limbs with ruthless efficiency. Hypothermia killed soldiers who simply sat down to rest and never got up again. Respiratory infections, exacerbated by the cold and the stress of combat, spread through units with devastating effect. The medical corps, designed to handle battlefield trauma, found themselves overwhelmed by conditions they had never trained to treat. Field hospitals became warehouses for the frozen and the dying. Evacuation to rear areas became impossible when the vehicles necessary for transport could not function in the extreme cold. Men died not from enemy action, but from the simple inability of their bodies to generate enough heat to sustain life. For Clara and the other civilians trapped in this frozen hell, survival required a level of resourcefulness that drew upon reserves of strength they had never known they possessed. She learned to recognize the signs of hypothermia and frostbite. She discovered which buildings in the village retained heat most effectively and how to create insulation from materials that would normally be considered worthless. The social bonds that held the community together were simultaneously strengthened and tested by the extreme conditions. Families shared their meager resources with neighbors, understanding that survival might depend on maintaining the social fabric that connected them all. But the same desperation that encouraged cooperation also created temptations toward betrayal and theft that challenged the moral foundations of people pushed beyond their limits. Children adapted to the new reality with the resilience that only the young possess, but also with a loss of innocence that marked them permanently. They learned to scavenge for food with the efficiency of experienced foragers. They developed an instinctive understanding of when German patrols were approaching and where to hide until the danger passed. They accepted hunger and cold as normal conditions rather than temporary hardships. The elderly, already weakened by the disruptions of war, began to die with increasing frequency. Each death was both a personal tragedy and a brutal reminder of the margins by which the rest of the community was surviving. Burial became impossible in the frozen ground, creating additional challenges for people already stretched beyond their capacity to cope. As December deepened into the heart of winter, both German forces and Soviet civilians faced the realization that this conflict had become something unprecedented in modern warfare. The rapid campaigns that had characterized the early years of the war had given way to a struggle for survival that tested not just military capability, but the fundamental resilience of entire populations. The German army, designed for mobility and quick victory, found itself trapped in a static situation that negated every advantage their training and equipment had provided. The Soviet Union, devastated by the initial invasion, discovered that its greatest ally was not military technology or strategic brilliance, but the simple, implacable hostility of winter itself. In this frozen landscape, victory and defeat were measured not in territory captured or strategic objectives achieved, but in the ability to survive another day, to maintain enough warmth to prevent death, enough nutrition to sustain life, enough hope to continue the struggle against an enemy that included not just human opponents, but the environment itself. The winter of 1941 was teaching lessons about the nature of warfare that would reshape military thinking for generations to come. But those lessons were being written in suffering that touched every person caught in its grip. Had the tide turns. By December of 1941, something fundamental had shifted in the balance of forces surrounding Moscow. The German advance, which had seemed unstoppable through the summer and autumn months, had ground to a halt in the frozen suburbs of the Soviet capital. What the Wehrmacht leadership had not anticipated was that winter would serve not merely as an obstacle to overcome, but as the foundation for a complete reversal of initiative. General Georgy Zhukov had been quietly repositioning forces throughout November, drawing on reserves that German intelligence had failed to detect. These were not the hastily assembled units that had borne the brunt of the initial invasion, but carefully preserved divisions. Seasoned troops who had been held back specifically for this moment. Many had been transferred from the Far Eastern Front, released by Stalin's confidence that Japan would not open a second front in Siberia. The counteroffensive began before dawn on December 6th, not with the massive artillery barrages that would later characterize Soviet operations, but with the methodical application of forces that understood winter warfare. These soldiers advanced through snow that reached their waists, using skis and sleds that the Germans had never thought to requisition. They wore white camouflage that rendered them nearly invisible against the landscape, while German forces remained conspicuous in their dark winter uniforms. When winter uniforms were available at all. For Erich Müller, now positioned in a defensive line west of Moscow, the first indication of the Soviet attack came not as a thunderous assault, but as a growing awareness that his sentries were disappearing. Radio contact would simply cease from forward positions. Patrols sent to investigate would find empty bunkers, weapons abandoned in positions that showed no signs of struggle. It was as if the winter itself had begun to consume his forces. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the tactical surprise. German units that had advanced hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks now found themselves retreating through the same villages they had occupied with such confidence. The speed of the reversal challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of their enemy and about their own capabilities in this environment. What made the Soviet counteroffensive particularly effective was not merely the element of surprise, but the methodical way it exploited every weakness that winter had created in the German position. Supply lines that had been stretched thin during the advance now became completely untenable under pressure. Equipment that had functioned adequately in defensive positions failed catastrophically when required for rapid movement in sub-zero temperatures. Soviet forces, meanwhile, demonstrated a level of adaptation that spoke to both preparation and desperation. They had learned to use the winter as a tactical ally, timing attacks to coincide with the periods of deepest cold when German equipment would be most likely to fail. They moved at night when the temperature differential would be most punishing to troops inadequately equipped for the conditions. Clara, witnessing the retreat from her village, observed something she had not expected to see. The German soldiers who passed through were no longer the confident occupiers of June. These were men whose faces showed the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting an enemy that includes the environment itself. Their equipment was improvised, their movements hurried, their discipline strained by circumstances that their training had never anticipated. But what struck her most profoundly was the realization that survival itself had become a form of victory. Every day that the village endured, every small act of resistance or simple persistence had contributed to this moment when the seemingly invincible force was revealing its limitations. The retreat exposed the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of Operation Barbarossa. The campaign had been planned as a quick, decisive action that would conclude before winter, but it had instead become exactly the type of prolonged engagement that German strategy was designed to avoid. The Wehrmacht found itself committed to a front that stretched across thousands of kilometers, facing an enemy that appeared to grow stronger as the conditions became more challenging. By mid-December, the retreat had taken on characteristics that would have been unimaginable to German planners 6 months earlier. Entire divisions were abandoning equipment that could not be maintained in the extreme cold. Vehicles were being destroyed by their own crews rather than risk capture. Supply depots that had been established during the advance were being evacuated or demolished. The human cost was becoming apparent in ways that transcended simple casualty figures. Frostbite casualties often exceeded combat losses. Units were losing cohesion not through enemy action, but through the basic challenge of maintaining communication and coordination in conditions that pushed human endurance beyond its limits. Yet within this retreat, there were also demonstrations of the resilience that would characterize the German response to crisis throughout the war. Officers improvised solutions to logistical problems that had no precedent in military doctrine. Soldiers adapted to conditions that their equipment and training had never envisioned. The retreat, while representing a strategic disaster, also revealed capacities for endurance that would make the eventual German defeat far more costly than it might otherwise have been. For Zhukov, observing the progress of the counteroffensive from his headquarters, the success represented validation of a strategic patience that had been difficult to maintain through the disasters of the summer and autumn. The decision to preserve reserves while accepting territorial losses had been controversial, but it had created the possibility for this reversal of fortune. The counteroffensive was not merely pushing German forces back from Moscow. It was demonstrating that the Red Army remained capable of coordinated offensive operations, that Soviet command structure could adapt and respond to changing circumstances, and that the industrial capacity relocated beyond the Urals was beginning to provide the material foundation for sustained resistance. As 1941 drew to a close, the winter that had seemed likely to complete the destruction of Soviet resistance was instead revealing itself as the foundation for renewal. The lessons learned in the desperate months of retreat were being applied in offensive operations that combined tactical innovation with strategic insight. The tide had indeed turned, though the full implications would only become clear in the months and years that followed. What was already evident was that Operation Barbarossa had failed in its essential objective of achieving quick, decisive victory. The war in the East would continue, but under fundamentally different conditions than either side had anticipated when the invasion began on that peaceful Saturday morning in June. Lingering shadows. The full implications would unfold slowly, like frost melting from winter windows, revealing landscapes forever changed beneath. In the months that followed that December counteroffensive, as spring returned to the Ukrainian countryside, Clara would walk through fields where wildflowers grew between rusted metal fragments, where children learned to play games that carefully avoided certain areas of Earth that still held dangerous secrets. The war would continue for years more, consuming millions of lives across a continent. But something fundamental had shifted in those first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa. The myth of German invincibility had cracked like ice under pressure, and with it, the certainty that modern warfare could achieve swift, decisive conclusions. What emerged instead was the terrible arithmetic of attrition, the slow, grinding reality that victory in the East would be measured not in weeks or months, but in the accumulated weight of human endurance. Erich Müller, if he survived those winter months, and many did not, would carry forward memories that no amount of military training had prepared him for. The sound of wind through abandoned villages, the sight of supply columns stretching endlessly across muddy roads that led nowhere, the gradual understanding that the civilization he thought he was defending had become something else entirely in the process of that defense. For the Soviet Union, survival had come at a cost that would echo through generations. Entire regions had been devastated, their populations scattered or destroyed, their infrastructure reduced to rubble and ash. The scorched earth tactics that helped stop the German advance had also consumed the accumulated work of decades. Farms and factories, schools and hospitals, all sacrificed to the greater necessity of preventing conquest. Yet in that sacrifice, something had been preserved that was perhaps more valuable than any material possession. The knowledge that resistance was possible, that even the most overwhelming military force could be stopped by the combination of human will and the patient alliance of geography and climate. This knowledge would spread beyond the Soviet borders, offering hope to occupied peoples across Europe who watched and waited for their own moments of liberation. As 1942 dawned, the war had become something neither side had anticipated. Not the swift campaign of German expectations, nor the defensive struggle Soviet planners had envisioned, but a vast grinding contest that would test every assumption about modern warfare and human endurance. The opening moves had been played, the initial strategies revealed as inadequate, and now both sides faced the prospect of a conflict whose duration and ultimate cost remained unknowable. In her village, Clara would plant seeds that spring, working soil that had been frozen and fought over, watered with tears and blood, but still capable of producing life. The act itself had become a form of testimony, a quiet declaration that the future remained possible, that human beings could still choose creation over destruction, growth over devastation. And in the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of those terrible months, that history's great turning points are measured not only in the movements of armies and the decisions of generals, but in the accumulated choices of ordinary people who decide each day whether to surrender to despair or continue the patient work of building tomorrow from the fragments of today, carrying forward the memory of what was lost while nurturing the hope of what might yet be saved.